Christ. Thank you everybody for coming to the Uganda 101 presentation. The Uganda 201 presentation will be next week, and the exam will be the following week. So, firstly, I just wanted to thank everybody for their generous donation. I want to thank everybody for their generous donations to PDI, Pathways Development Initiative, that was organized over the summer by Jill Peterson. I'll go into a little bit more depth later about where these donations went and how it impacted the community, but just as a baseline, the average household income in Bududa is about $100 household, and that's usually 6 children, a mother and a father. And that's $100 for all those 8 people. And our church raised over $3,500, so you can just imagine how far that money went in helping the people of Bududa. So, where is Uganda? So Uganda is in the Great Lakes region of Africa. This region is generally called East Africa, so East Africa is generally considered to be Uganda, which is up there, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. And this right here is Lake Victoria, which is the mouth of the River Nile. Uganda has the city of Jinja, and Jinja is the mouth of the River Nile, and it's very beautiful and very nice. And it's not a very clean river, so I wouldn't recommend going rafting. So in Uganda, they're a largely Bantu population, and there's over 100 languages that are spoken within the country. And this is particularly problematic because the lingua franca of East Africa is Swahili, which combines both Bantu and Arabic elements. But during the Ugandan Civil War, the language that was spoken by the oppressive political group was Swahili, and this was in about the 1960s and 70s, and so because this group spoke Swahili, it never gained traction with the larger population in Uganda, and so most of the tribal languages remain. The official language of Uganda is English. However, most people's English is a little bit different idiomatically than we're used to in American English, because they were a British colony, and so they use a lot of Britishisms like a trunk is a boot, a lorry is a truck, and so on. So Uganda is a fairly large country. It's about 42, 43 million. They have a rapidly growing population. It's the second youngest in the world, second only to the Central African Republic. And this causes some unique population and political problems because of such a high birth rate. So the capital city is Kampala, and it became the capital of Uganda in the early 20th century because it was where the largest British colonial concentration was, and it's called Kampala because it was Camp Impala, because there were lots of impalas living there at the time, the wild deer, and the British soldiers jokingly called it Camp Impala, and then that caught on eventually, and so it's called Kampala. And Kampala has some of the worst pollution, the worst city planning, and the worst traffic in all of Africa. If you listen to the BBC News report daily on Africa, there will almost always be a segment about how the traffic in Uganda is terrible, the traffic in Kampala is terrible, the air quality in Kampala is terrible. So these are just some major issues that Uganda has in terms of its central legislature. So this is just some development information. Their GDP per capita is $1,788.59. The United States is about $60,000. This figure is in dollars. So $60,000 a year per capita is the GDP in America, and just almost $1,800 is the GDP per capita in Uganda. And so Uganda is a very poor country, and the Human Development Index is one of the lowest in the world, and one of the lowest in the region, mostly due to some political instability that happened during the 1960s and 70s. So they didn't get as many of the reforms as most countries did during that time period. They're a largely Christian population, along with southern Sudan. If any of you know about the conflict in southern Sudan and northern Sudan, the country is closer to Egypt, so they're mostly Muslim. Southern Sudan is largely Christian. They split in 2012. And as you go further down the African continent, people go from largely Muslim into largely Christian, with the largest denominations being Catholic and Anglican in Uganda mostly. But Interestingly enough, Uganda has one of the most peaceful coexistences between Christians and Muslims. For example, there's a law that animals can only be slaughtered by Muslims, so technically all of the meat in the country, minus pork, is halal. So that's just an example of some religious collaboration, if you will. So, like I said before, Uganda is primarily composed of the Bantu ethnic group, which migrated to the area approximately 10,000 years ago. In addition, there are Nilotic and Pygmy peoples that are located in Uganda, but the Bantu are the majority of the people, and the Bantu languages are the majority of the languages that are spoken in Uganda, but they're not mutually intelligible. So even if you're from 50 miles away from each other, if you're from a different tribe, if you're a different people, the languages are completely unintelligible with one another, and that's one of the largest difficulties with development in Uganda. So, like I said before, Uganda was part of British East Africa, and it gained its independence from Great Britain in 1962, along with Kenya, and it was split in two, largely along arbitrary lines. So a lot of the tribes that are in eastern Uganda are largely in Kenya, and vice versa. So there's a lot of this interregional mixing. As you'll see in many countries in Africa, the borders were drawn in either the early or mid-20th century, and they're relatively arbitrary. And the largest ethnic group in Uganda is called the Baganda people. And the Baganda king is still an active monarch, although he's largely ceremonial. And the country of Uganda was named Uganda after the Baganda people because they were the most cooperative with the British during the colonial period. So, Uganda has had a very interesting political history. I'm sure many of you in the room have heard of the notorious Idi Amin. So the first president of Uganda was Milton Obote, who assumed power in 1962. But then, a little bit later on, Idi Amin had a military coup. He was a general in the Ugandan army, had a military coup over Milton Obote, forced out any kind of British influence, forcing people to call him the conqueror of the British Empire. And there's a very interesting movie called The Last King of Scotland that's about the life of Idi Amin. He was a very bizarre, strange, radical man. And he's often referred to as the butcher of Uganda because tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands, were killed during the period of his about 10 to 12-year reign. And for lack of a better way of putting it, he was a genocidal, fundamentalist, cannibalistic socialist. He was a real pain in the neck. He was aligned with the Soviet Union for a while, and so there were all kinds of political turbulences. And to this day, all of the doors in Uganda, if you go to buy a door, they're made of plate steel, and they have a special locking mechanism. The locks can only be opened from the inside. And so there's a special way that you stick your arm in the door to unlock it. And this is a holdover from the period when there were, during the Civil War, when there were marauding soldiers going around looking for people and trying to kill people. So these doors are a safety measure that people have put in place, and they're still present even to the current day. And then Idi Amin was overthrown again by Milton Obote in the early 70s. Then Milton Obote was overthrown by Yoweri Museveni, who was the current president of Uganda, and their current constitution is from 1995. This is Museveni right here. He is from the western part of Uganda, and he retains a very strong Bushman image, and that's why he's often seen wearing his hat. And currently, as I said before, there is a large youth bulge, and so there's a large election controversy with a popular singer. His name is Bobby Wine, who is trying to drum up support amongst the young people to challenge Museveni because he's been in power for 33 years now. And Bobby Wine has been in and out of prison for bizarre reasons, like because he's a musician, apparently his sound permits were not up to par, and so they put him in prison for that. He had to seek political asylum in the United States for a while for medical treatment, and pretty much everything that goes wrong politically in Uganda gets blamed on Bobby Wine. So if you'd like it's a very interesting political situation over there, so if it's something you're interested in, there's always something new coming out every week about that. So how did I find myself in Uganda? So the first semester of my freshman year in college, every day at Lehigh we get a morning announcements email. And I usually don't read them because they're full of things that aren't pertinent to me whatsoever. But it just so happened that one day I was scrolling through and there was an advertisement for a presentation about the Lehigh program in Uganda. And so I went, and it was an interesting presentation, and I thought, okay, this is better than, going to goodness knows where. This will be a real cultural experience. And so I followed up, I applied for research grants, I got those research grants, and my first research was on vaccination. Because in Uganda, there is a vaccine-resistant group called the Abajiri, and there have been several polio and measles outbreaks pursuant to this vaccine-resistant group. And they thought that this group was concentrated to the area just north of Kampala. So this is about where Kampala is. They thought it was largely right here, but in my research I discovered that this vaccine-resistant group is also over here in Bududa. And so Bududa is where I do my work. It's this little district over here, right next to Kenya, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So in addition, my research this past year is about alcohol consumption and alcohol culture, because Uganda is actually one of the drunkest places on earth. It is the drunkest country in Africa, and they predominantly make their own moonshine out of oil drums using molasses. And when poor farmers are done working for the day, they come, they drink their molasses distillate, and they often go blind or die and these kinds of things. So the government has been putting in all kinds of measures to try to prevent people from drinking this stuff, but they're just encouraging people to drink it, and it's all tied in. Economically, it's a disaster. But interestingly enough, the name for this hooch is waraji. So waraji comes from, they used to call it Dutch courage as well. During the colonial period, when they would have the tribal peoples fight in wars against each other, they would get them real drunk with gin and force them into battle. And so consequently, they began to call it war gin, and war gin just got turned into waraji. So waraji is a catch-all term for distilled spirits in Uganda, and it's what people predominantly consume over there. Yes, so the Bagisu region is primarily where I was working, over in the eastern half of the country, and the Bagisu are very unique for a couple of reasons. They're a Bantu people. They're also called the Masaba, and their language is called Lugisu. And they're very much associated with the mountain called Mount Elgon. So Mount Elgon straddles the border between Uganda and Kenya. It used to be the highest point in Africa until the dome collapsed about 10,000 years ago. And the tribe is very much associated with this mountain, so they practically refuse to move away from this mountain, even if it's economically or socially disadvantageous for them. So their capital city for the subregion is Mbale, and this is the bank row on Mbale. I took this picture. Most of the pictures in this presentation I took myself. And it's there's two streets in the city. There is a row with banks. There is a grocery store. There is a market where you can buy produce, but the grocery stores buy all the produce from the market. It's a very interesting system that they have going on in terms of the way that crops get from the countryside and regions like in places like Bududa, which is where I was staying, and they find their way into this capital city. So recently there was a bit of a dispute between the Bagisu people and the central government, which is run largely by the Uganda people, because Mbale was not given city status in Uganda during a referendum, a national referendum. And this was problematic because Mbale has been trying to bolster its status and bolster tourism for nearby Mount Elgon, but because they were not given city status, they're unable to apply for World Bank loans or IMF grants or any of these kinds of things. And so there's a bit of a tension between the people in Mbale and the surrounding region and the central government because of this issue. And the Bagisu are also famous because they practice adult circumcision. They have a special ritual that's done every 2 years with a special dance, and they practice adult circumcision for the men, and you're not considered a full member of the tribe and a full man until you've undergone circumcision. So the Bududa district, which is where I was staying, it's a little bit further closer to Kenya than in Mbale. It's known as the Forgotten District for a multitude of reasons. They have the least staffed hospital in the country. They have the worst performing schools in the country. And part of the reason, so allow me to back up a bit, the PDI non-governmental organization, which is what my University of Lehigh has partnered with, established a school back in 2013 to provide pre-primary education to students so that they would be able to perform better against students in more urban areas on national exams, because performance on national exams strongly dictates whether people will be able to get into universities, and pre-primary education is a good way for students to get their English skills up to par, and they perform markedly better on these national examinations. So the PDI Education Center, it started as a one-room schoolhouse. It's now a larger facility, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So Bududa is famous for a couple of things within the country of Uganda. It's the largest coffee producing region in Africa outside of Ethiopia. They have some of the highest malaria rates in East Africa. They have landslides, which are a consequence of the terrain. It's very steep. The soil is very loose, and so it's very good for growing things like coffee and bananas. And because it's good for growing coffee and bananas, they plant coffee and bananas. They take out native trees, it displaces the soil, and you have landslides. And as I said before, they have problems with measles, polio, cholera, West Nile virus, dysentery, diphtheria, pertussis, all these kinds of diseases that have been largely eradicated are quite prevalent due to the poverty in this area, and most people do not have access to pit latrines even, so open defecation occurs quite a bit, and only about 20% of people have access to proper latrine facilities. So that's what perpetuates a lot of these kinds of diseases. And in addition, Bududa is very famous for bullfighting. And unlike in other parts of the world where it's man versus bull with a cape, this is bull versus bull. And so the farmers will bring their trophy bulls down from the mountains, and they will bring them into a soccer field, and then you'll get a big ring of people, and they'll be fighting each other. The two bulls will be fighting each other, and there'll be a big ring of people, and there's mud flying everywhere, and if you don't get out of the way in time, you will be killed. And it's quite common that happens actually, because people want to be right in there with the action. And I'll admit, it's quite exciting, and it's quite the cultural experience. So the Pathways Development Initiative, also known as PDI, is the organization which I was speaking about earlier. It was founded in 2013, I believe, by David and Elizabeth Zale as a grassroots organization in order to improve the state of pre-primary education in the district. David Zale, who is now retired, was a secondary school teacher, and so he had a lot of the skills and resources and know-how to start a school in the area, and so along with his wife, Elizabeth, they underwent this project. And so their first thing was the education center, which started in their home as a one-room schoolhouse. It's now branched out, and you can see they have two buildings now, this one right here, and it's the other one behind the sign, and they also have a nice playground. And so they have about 6 grades, so three pre-primary grades, and then 3 primary grades. And in addition, since they've had such success with the education center, they also have a village savings and loan organization, which is a type of microfinancing where people will get together and they will save their money because they don't have banks there. So if you want to get a loan or something, it's generally on good faith from a family member or something like that. But now with the Village Savings and Loans Association, they're able to kind of have this, they're able to foster these organizations so that people are able to partake in the savings culture, and so that they're better able to finance their children's education, they're able to buy livestock, and these kinds of things. In addition, there is a second chance program for girls that have dropped out of school to go back and to pursue vocations such as cutting hair, or cooking, or computer skills, these kinds of things, so that they can find their way back into the workforce, because most girls in Bududa begin to have children when they're around 13 or 14 years old, and once you start having kids while you're in school, you know, things tend to fall apart, especially if you're at a younger age. So this is something that PDI has been trying to to improve in the community. In addition, they have a sports program. They run a soccer clinic with some soccer coaches that come and volunteer to help children to not drink, and instead they play sports. It's a lot of fun. It engages a lot of the community because soccer is a very big sport over there. I remember last year when I was there, it was during the World Cup, and there would often be one place where you could go to watch the World Cup on a TV about this big with a solar panel that they would have charging a battery all day, so they could watch it on this little black and white TV, and everybody would be going nuts. They love soccer. And recently, because of the landslides, PDI has created an arm for disaster relief, and the donation from St. Peter and Paul has in large part helped to bolster this disaster relief wing. And so it's providing things like food and shelter and mattresses and solar lamps and these kinds of very practical things for people that have been displaced because of these landslides, because they're becoming even more prevalent as the population continues to grow and people are forced to live in terrain that's compromised and less stable. So the Orthodox Church in Uganda. The Orthodox Church in Uganda was founded around the 1920s. It's referred to as an indigenous Orthodox church because there were a group of Anglicans that were interested in learning a little bit more about early Christianity. They were not satisfied with the church in Uganda at the time, and so they sought out texts and books and these kinds of things to learn about the original Christian faith. And sure enough, they discovered correctly that the original Christian faith was Orthodoxy. And so they reached out to the Patriarchate of Alexandria, who sent them several priests and educated them. And the great-grandson of the first priest in Uganda is now the Metropolitan of Uganda, His Eminence Metropolitan Jonah Lwanga, who's been doing a lot of good work, especially in the capital city of Kampala, to try to make the Orthodox Church stronger. The Orthodox population in Uganda is still very small. It's about 30,000 people.